Hello, everyone. Welcome to Of Gods and Game Masters presents Mythology and World Building with a concentration on creation myths. Good afternoon. I am your host, Jack Kellum. Here at Of Gods and Game Masters, I build worlds and gods and villains. I drink coffee and I know things. So, what I'm going to start off with, I think, is a quick read through of a creation myth I wrote for the world of Loria, which is a fantasy world inspired primarily by Mesopotamian myth and folklore, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, all those sorts of things. And it'll give us kind of a beginning and a grounding for much of the rest of the discussion. I will only divert into discussion of Castleton if Castleton peeps show up. All right. In the depths before time, there was only chaos. Su raged against itself, ever-changing, formless, thoughtless. But in infinite chaos, there is infinite possibility, and Adsil woke, alone in the emptiness, a spot of calm and order, aware of itself. Alone, it could not withstand Su, but it could conceive of more, and it did. It became they. They thought of more, and formed it in their mind, and spoke. The first word was Uras, the earth, the foundation of all, and Uras came to know itself, and it became he. On that foundation was the next word spoken, and the next word was Ilu, the water of life, the oceans and rivers crossing the surface of Uras. And Ilu came to know itself, and it became she. Adsil thought, then, of wind and storm and of currents and emotion, of the interactions between sky, earth, and water, and spoke the third word, which was Ugir. And Ugir came to know itself and became he, always angry, always wanting, never satisfied, but stalwart against Su, foremost protector of sky, earth, and water. For defense requires violence as much as attack. And then the one alone, Adsil, thought of brilliant lamps to light the world, of night and day, of chariots on eternal circuit, always on watch. And Adsil spoke, and the words were Dutu, the sun, who watches the day and warms the world. Dutu came to know itself, and it became he, and vigilance against disorder, against lawlessness, against strife became his purpose, and his light warmed all. Mumu, the moon, was spoken next, and came to know itself, and became he, and she, and they, and it, ever changing to suit any need. Mumu's chariot crosses the night sky, and Mumu watches the world in the hours of darkness, taking whatever form they must to fulfill their purpose. But they wax and wane with the effort, and give of themselves to the other sections of the sky, motes of light that are the stars, so the world is never completely without light, and eyes watch it always from the heavens. The last word spoken of the first sentence was Libis, heart, that all the gods and other beings might always have the courage and feeling to fight Su. And Libis came to know itself and became she. And she lives in the hearts of all living things, causing them to strive for better, for more, causing love and anger and hate, for none of these can exist alone. And that was the first sentence of the first paragraph of the first story, and Adsil saw all these things that they had spoken, and was well pleased. After the first paragraph was spoken, and Dutu and Mumu each passed once around the world. The first day had passed, and in that passing, Adsil conceived of the concept and spoke it, and the word was Zal, the passing of time. And Zal came to know itself, and became she, and she measures the passing of time, and sees all of time, and knows what has been and what is to come. And then, last of the spoken, Zal turned in turn to their speaker, and spoke. And they spoke long and long of things to come, though none have ever known what was said. And 1,000 times around the world each chariot, each lamp passed, and all was calm. But outside Adsil's embrace, Sul raged against itself, and churned, and reached for the speaker, and the spoken. And the elder god set into motion the plan that Zal had made with Adsil, to what end we still know not. In accordance with the plan, life rose from Ilu as Adsil spoke, and Ugir carried then the living waters to Uras. Whereas rain, the waters fell upon Uras's earth and mingled, and took fertility therefrom, and coursing down the rocks of Uras flowed again into the sea. And where water touched earth, life took shape. And Dutu and Mumu passed again around the world, racing a tide of green as all the plants of old arose. The first tree, the willow, ever weeping, rose beside the banks of the river at the center of the world, and its roots reach to the world below, and its branches unto heaven, and it is fed by the mingling of Uras and Ilu, and made healthy by the light of Dutu and Mumu. And as the green spread, Su recoiled, then reached again. Unrelenting, Adsil spoke on, and from the caverns and crevices of Uras crept animals, things that walked on 4 limbs and slithered on their bellies, and more such things arose in Ilu, and came from Ilu, and the world teemed with life. And Su recoiled, repulsed, and reached again. But the plan was not complete, and Adsil spoke on, and each of the first spoken gave life to what they spoke. From the deep caves of Uras came the dwarves, first of all speaking mortals, and they wandered the land and tasted of its bounty, but of Ilu they were sore afraid. From the woods and the wild, the waters and the trees came the elves, fleeter and longer limbed and longer lived, but not so enduring nor as strong. Second of the speaking mortals, but thought themselves first, far as they were from the dwarven hills and mountains. Third, the orcs, sons and daughters of the storm, quick to love or anger, hardy, tall, and strong. The wide storm-swept plains and frozen tundras were their source, and the rocky broken wind lashed islands. Fourth came humanity. From every place that Dutu shone, most numerous of the children of the spoken, and the most adaptable. Last of the direct children of the spoken themselves into being through the land by the unspoken themselves. The little people, the gnomes and the halflings, cousins born from hills and rolling meadows, the kindly folk, the daughters and sons of Libes. And Su recoiled, and for a time reached not. So, that's one example of a creation myth, and it has a number of elements in common with other creation myths. So, one of the most fundamental elements in nearly every creation myth is the concept of what existed before creation. All across human mythology, there are some very distinct common threads for the very beginning and what existed before the very beginning. In Abrahamic faith, for instance, we have, in the beginning there was darkness and void, or formlessness and void, or, depending on how that is translated. It's often interpreted as nothingness, but if you really look at it, it has more in common with the Greek notion of what existed before creation, which is primordial chaos with a K. That fundamental somethingness, but undifferentiated, uncategorized, uncontrolled. In a great many myths, for instance, the majority of Egyptian myths, several versions of the Hindu creation myth, a number of Native American creation myths, that fundamental formlessness or chaos is represented as a limitless ocean, right? A sort of liquid that is infinite in scope. It goes in all directions. It is conceived of to a certain extent as having a surface, but it also is of infinite depth, right? It goes up an infinite amount, it goes down an infinite amount, but there's nonetheless sort of a surface. In Norse myth, we have a slightly different kind of formlessness where the mingling of the cold of Niflheim with the heat of Muspelheim creates this sort of cold mist in the area between in what is called Gnunga Gap. But it is still fundamentally a formless chaos. And that formless chaos is kind of just a pool of infinite potential in most of the stories. And then the first thing that happens in that is whatever creator entity takes an action or thinks or says a word. In the Abrahamic faith, as translated into the Christian faith, that first utterance is fiat lux, let there be light. And then light shines upon the face of the deep, and things are started. Things begin to be made. In Egyptian myth, in one version or other, the progenitor god may create other gods by masturbation, by pleasuring themselves. They might create the world by raising up the primordial mound out of the waters and starting to craft things from it. In Native American mythology, many of them are very similar in that there's nothing but ocean, and some creature must dive down to the bottom of it and bring dirt up to make land. What all of these things have in common is that you have the formlessness, but then the will of the divine is laid upon it and begins to categorize it. It begins to formalize it. It does not create substance per se, right? It does not spontaneously generate the world from literally nothing in most cases. What happens is it takes from the chaos and lays rules upon that substance. So, in the case of the mythology I just read, I took that and I merged it somewhat with the Mesopotamian concept that later made its way into the Abrahamic faiths of the word and the thought and the concept which of divine decree, which in Mesopotamian belief is called the May, is enough to literally make things, right? This is demonstrated all the way from the beginning of human mythology, at least in the West, all the way up to Kabbalistic mystical thought, right? And thus into Hermetic magic. The word abracadabra basically means I will this thing into existence. I create as I speak. So let it be written, so let it be done. As I will, so mote it be. The fundamental notion of thought and will making reality comes from that very beginning notion at the beginning of human civilization in the West. I say in the West because I cannot be absolutely certain that even Mesopotamia predates, for instance, the Indus Valley civilizations. It's not 100% clear. They definitely informed each other in both directions, but it isn't 100% clear which one came first. But when you're creating a myth of creation for your world, you need to look at those things that almost all mythologies have in common, because they point to an understanding of the universe that most humans seem to share, which is that the universe was disordered, it was formless, it was nothing, not because there was no substance, but because there was no structure, until such time as divine will conceived of said structure and spoke it into being. The way this divine will manifests happens in a lot of different ways, but when you're starting from the Sumerian tradition, or the Mesopotamian traditions, I should say, it starts with the word. It starts with the concept of creation. Now, another thing that you'll find in many traditions, again, starting with the Mesopotamian, is that in the lack of structure, in the place where the world isn't there yet, there's some primordial being, something that predates the creator god or gods. In the case of ancient Mesopotamian mythology, that is Tiamat and her husband Absu, representing very specifically the fundamental primordial waters. They are, in fact, that chaos substance from the beginning. In the case of Norse myth, in Gununga Gap, you have the primordial being Ymir, from which the gods themselves arise, and then they kill him to make the world. Likewise, back with Tiamat, that primordial entity, Tiamat and Absu have children. Those children are the gods. The gods start being real noisy. Absu gets a headache and is like, we should kill him. Tiamat convinces him not to, but then the gods think, okay, well, I heard him talking about that, so we should kill him first. And they do. And that is the source of Tiamat being pissed off at everybody forever. And then, one particular god, either Anu or in later versions Marduk, kills Tiamat and they make the world from her body. And it is that being, whoever it is, that kills Tiamat that gains kingship of the gods. It comes down to that which conquers chaos is king, basically. Just as Odin, Vili, and Vi, which may be Odin, Loki, and Onir, killing Ymir to create the world, and thus Odin becomes king, right? The fundamental notion there is one of order conquering chaos. But don't misunderstand, it doesn't make the beings doing the conquering what D&D would consider lawful good or lawful neutral or lawful at all, just that they have imposed some sort of order on the universe and become ruler thereby. In this story, the example is much less initially violent, because Adsil is able to create order specifically to hold off Su, rather than having to destroy Su to create that order. Even in the cases where the entity, the primordial entity, is killed, there is always, or almost always, an offshoot, right? Chaotic things born from it that are trying to return the universe to their original primordial state. In the case of Ymir, the giants, the Jotun, which comes from an ancient term meaning the eaters. But it's also related to the word utan, which means outside. Giants are born from and of the chaos outside Midgard and Asgard, outside the fence. That's what the guard means, right? So Utan, or Utgard, Outgard, Utangard, that is the place, which includes Jotunheim and all these other places. Those are the places outside the god's fence, i.e. in the primordial chaotic areas. And the Jotun, or as the Anglo-Saxons would later call them, the Etin, the eaters, exist in opposition to the gods, not because they're fundamentally different, but because they exist to render down the structure that the gods have made. In Norse myth, for instance, the Jotun and the Asir are basically the same kind of being. They're born from initially the body of Ymir, and there's interbreeding back and forth. In Mesopotamian myth, Tiamat is the mother of all the gods, but she is also the mother of all the monsters, because she created these monsters and these demons specifically to act as her army against the gods in revenge for killing her husband Apsu. So what you get from these general creation myths is an understanding of the world that has been created as a bulwark, a fortress against the forces of chaos, as a fragile soap bubble or bubble in foam floating on the top of a limitless ocean that can be quite easily destroyed if the gods and their forces are not constantly on guard. And in many cases, those forces are also humanity. So, assuming at that point what you're establishing is an adversarial relationship between the gods and some anti-god force, like the Jotun or the monsters and demons serving Tiamat, right? Um, and most mythologies are going to need to create some sort of adversarial um, relationship like that so as to explain the existence of evil or disruption, at least, of chaos and inimical forces in your universe. Um, and that's one of the things about creation myths, one of the things they exist for, right? Is to not only explain where the universe came from, but explain why it is the way it is when the people that either write the creation myth or discover the creation myth, depending on perspective, uh, come to that conclusion. Um, when you're writing a creation myth for a tabletop role-playing game world or a fantasy world or any for fiction or anything like that, you need to think even before you get into the instance of creation. You need to decide right away, maybe, a couple of things. Is the creation myth just what the mortals of your world have made up about their world? Is it metaphorical? Is it objective truth? Is it a subjective story about what happened at the beginning from the perspective of one or more entities involved? For instance, in my creation myth for the world of Naliga, I have two of them clearly written already, right? But I'm gonna write more. The first one, of creation and the blinding of Kul and the murder of Harukan, is written from the perspective of the gods of the Haruk and the people of the Haruk, which are fundamentally the goblinoid species of the world of Naliga. The second version of the myth that I wrote is written from the perspective of the Church of Eklath, or the Brightness, which is the creator deity for the humans and halflings in the world. I intend to write a third version of the creation myth that is revolving around the perspective of the elven gods. Because in the world of Naliga, these differences in perspective on what happened at the beginning have led to these very extreme interactions and these ways of seeing the other sapient beings on their world as inherently evil from the perspective of each different group, right? So, like, the Haruk have these deep-seated animosity toward the humans and the halflings and the elves and the dwarves based on their understanding of what occurred at the beginning. And the followers of Iklath have a similar thing toward the Haruk, and to a lesser extent toward the elves and dwarves because of these odd occurrences. And then the elves are in fact taught that the Haruk are inherently evil because of their perspective on what happened at the beginning. But that's a world without what Dungeons and Dragons would consider alignment. So the important elements of the creation myth are establish as you're writing, or as you're writing it or before you're writing it, if it's objective truth, subjective truth, or just what the human or what the mortals think happened. Those change your perspective on all of it. You can either, as I did with the successor states of Rhaegar, create all of your gods ahead of time and then figure out what sort of way they would create. Or you can write your creation myth in tandem with your god creation and understand that they come, they come into being together, right? The world and the gods, and you move forward from there. But very often you're going to want to reach to those basic concepts of the primordial chaos, however you want to represent it, whether as an empty plane of air, perhaps, or an actual void, or an eternal mist, or possibly the most common, the boundless ocean. Is there a primordial entity there that is a threat to creation, or any number of primordial entities there that are a threat to creation? And is that where fiends come from, if you have fiends? Or is that where things worse than fiends come from, if you're getting into like a Cthulhuoid Lovecraftian approach to the universe, where even fiends like devils and demons are part of creation, but outside that little bubble of foam on the surface, there's this infinite depth of gigantic fishy things that are so much worse, or at least so much more alien. I've been perhaps overly fond of that approach in recent years. But the creation myth allows you to get a really good feel for what your world is about, for how it developed to what it is. It can help you establish some of the fundamental tensions in that exist in your universe, especially if there are horrific supernatural monstrosities that you have to worry about. Gives you a source for such things, because even if they aren't the primordial entities from outside themselves, they may be the monsters spawned by said primordial entity, like in the case of Tiamat. In the successor states of Rhaegar, I've kind of used both versions, right? In Vidya, the primordial dragon is killed at the beginning and her body thrown across the universe as they create the world. But from her body, inside creation, are spawned the dark gods, and then those dark gods use her body and her blood to create monsters. But still outside the bubble of creation, there's still other things. And the fundamental goal of the dark gods is to reduce creation to nothing, so that their primordial deity can return, so that the great draconic thing that is Nvidia can go back to swimming through the void and eating up all the entities, hopping through the forest, picking up field mice, bopping them on the head, metaphorically. But yeah, the creation myths and early myths in general are very good for kind of explaining in-universe fundamental conflicts, whether that be between the supernatural entities or between the sapient lineages and species, because that's what I did in Naliga, was set up the reasons for the rivalry and hatred between the groups. Whereas in the successor states of Rhaegar, there isn't really rivalry and hatred between the groups of things created by the bright gods. They simply have rivalries and hatreds between them and all the things created by the dark gods. And primarily in the successor states of Rhaegar, the sapient beings still have the freedom of choice. They just may not realize they have it. So it can take a minute or so and some hard work to get some of the creatures the dark gods created or corrupted free of that enslavement. Creation myths are also very, like I said, it's good to help use them to establish how your world is organized. You can often establish the gods as they stand. You can establish the cosmology. What are the sun and moon? Why do they move around? What is the sky? Right? Mythology in the real world is a way to explain in terms of story what the universe is and why it is. To give a narrative to that which we do not necessarily understand, to make it less frightening or to inform how we interact with it. When you're writing your mythology for a fantasy world or a tabletop role-playing game, that could be the purpose of the mythology. But again, it could also be a straightforward telling of how the universe came to be as it is, whether that be objective truth or simply one entity or one side's point of view. And I think that point of view can tell you a lot about the cultures involved. One of the big reasons I think mythology is so important in tabletop role-playing is that either the mythology tells you what the culture that came up with the mythology is like and who they are fundamentally as people, or it tells you what kind of people those mythological deities and those mythological events would create. Either way, there's a very tight and clear bonding, and it's a causational. The problem is the big question is, which direction does the causality flow? And that's entirely up to you as a writer, is what is the causal relationship between myth and the world as it exists? Which direction does it go? Of course, and I think I'm probably going to end on this note. I'm going to end on the note that you could have the causal relationship run both ways. The world is as it is because the events of the mythology happened and the gods made it so. But also, the mythology is what it is because that is what the sapient creatures of that world believe happened. That, my friends, comes down to consensual reality. And once again, that fundamental notion of the imposition of will on the universe as creation, like you might find in a world such as Mage the Awakening or Mage the Ascension, which can totally be fantasy as much as it is. It can totally be ancient fantasy as much as it is urban fantasy, if you want to look at it that way.